Discovery of bodies in a storage barn shakes a Texas rural town. It was a humid September morning in 2005 when the unsettling discovery was made. Out near the edge of town, past the endless rows of golden cornfields and hushed cattle farms, an old, decrepit storage barn stood in desolation. Locals in the small Texas town of Meadow Ridge hardly paid it any attention anymore. It was one of those places swallowed up by time, its peeling wooden panels and rusty locks a shadow of the bustling machinery it once housed decades ago. But that day, the barn became the epicenter of horror. Edgar Simmons, a retired cattle rancher and lifelong resident of Meadow Ridge, had driven up to collect scrap metal around the barn. He was the kind of man who believed in fixing things rather than throwing them away. Stepping out of his dusty Ford pickup truck, he pulled his gloves snugly over his hands and tucked a flashlight into his waistband before heading toward the building. The barn's creaky wooden door resisted as Edgar tugged on it. After a good yank, it groaned open, revealing a stiff darkness within. Edgar stepped inside, squinting as he adjusted to the dim light seeping through the cracks in the barn walls. The air was thick, carrying a pungent scent he couldn't quite place at first. Something acrid, something unnatural. It only took a few steps inside for Edgar's stomach to churn as the smell grew stronger. "Smells like something died in here," he muttered to himself, pulling out his flashlight and shining it across the dusty floor. His boots crunched on broken glass and hay as he carefully navigated the cluttered barn. The beam of light brushed over old farm tools, broken wooden crates and heaps of tattered tarps. And then, it landed on something else entirely. There, half hidden beneath a decaying layer of hay and dust-coated tarp, were two lifeless forms. Edgar froze, his heart pounding in his chest as his mind grappled with what he was seeing. Were those bodies? He hesitated to step closer but felt compelled to understand what he'd stumbled upon. Shakily he reached down and pulled back the edge of the tarp. What he uncovered confirmed his worst fears. Two people lay there, their faces stiff and pale as wax statues, their bodies contorted into unnatural angles. He could recognize now where the gut-wrenching smell came from. Their clothing was muddied and torn, and faint streaks of what appeared to be dried blood were smeared over the tarp. Edgar staggered backward, nearly tripping over a loose plank as he fought to catch his breath. "Jesus Christ!" The words slipped out of his mouth before he reached for the cell phone in his pocket. His call to the sheriff's office was frantic, but he managed to convey the grim message. Within the hour, Meadow Ridge's normally sleepy streets buzzed with sirens as sheriff's deputies and crime scene investigators swarmed the remote property. Red and blue lights flickered against the barn's faded wooden exterior as crime tape was stretched around the perimeter. Officers stood somberly outside, discussing the scene while others braced themselves before stepping into the barn to inspect the grim discovery. One deputy, a young officer named Rachel Diaz who had just joined the force 6 months prior, stepped outside to get some air. Her face was pale and her stomach churned from the heavy odor inside the barn and the reality of what they were dealing with. "We've got a double homicide, no doubt about it," Sheriff Wade Harrison, a grizzled lawman with 20 years on the job, informed the small crowd of gathered journalists who had heard whispers of something big brewing on the outskirts of town. Harrison removed his hat and wiped his brow before returning his attention to the barn. His eyes scanned the area, taking in every detail: the footprints in the barn's dirt floor, the disturbed piles of hay, and the ominous marks that told a story he had yet to piece together. "This wasn't random," he said almost to himself, his mind already racing with potential leads. For a town like Meadow Ridge, where everyone knew everyone and crime was rarely worse than an occasional break-in, the discovery was more than shocking. By the end of the day, rumors were already circulating. Who were these people? How had they ended up in a place most folks had forgotten existed? And, most chillingly, who could do such a thing? As investigators began their work, inching closer to the victims with flashlights and tools, the small town descended into whispers of theories, suspicions, and fear. Whatever had happened in that forgotten barn wasn't just a tragedy, it was the beginning of a dark unraveling in the fabric of Meadow Ridge, Texas. Who were the victims? Paul and Martha Klein weren't just names in the local obituaries, they were the kind of people who made up the backbone of a small rural community like Meadow Ridge. To most residents in the town, the Kleins were a picture of simplicity and hard work, living out their days on a modest piece of land tucked away just past the eastern edge of town. They had been married for over 35 years, turning their small plot of farmland into a lively space where they raised a few cows, cultivated a vegetable garden, and often shared their surplus produce with neighbors. Paul, age 66, was a sturdy, sun-weathered man whose calloused hands told the stories of decades spent tending to livestock and fixing fences. He was quiet but kind, always ready to lend a helping hand when someone's tractor broke down, or a storm blew through and knocked someone's barn off its foundation. Folks in town would often see him at the local feed store chatting with old buddies or lugging sacks of grain into the back of his old truck. He was the kind of man everyone trusted, a salt-of-the-earth type who believed in hard work and keeping your promises. Martha, a few years younger at 62, had a warmth about her that made her presence instantly comforting. She was known for her home-baked pies, which regularly won ribbons at the county fair, and her relentless commitment to the small church where she sang in the choir every Sunday. Her laughter often carried through the aisles of the local grocery store as she stopped to chat with everyone she passed, always asking after their families, always remembering the little details. Though life on the farm wasn't easy, Martha had a knack for making it feel idyllic. Her flower beds bloomed each spring in a riot of color, a testament to her patient care. The Klein home wasn't extravagant by any means, but it was cozy, filled with handmade quilts, family photos, and knickknacks Martha had collected during their travels to nearby fairs and markets. Their one and only son, Michael, had moved out years ago, leaving the Kleins to quietly enjoy their later years in a rhythm that seemed almost unshakable. Almost. "They were the heart of this town," said their neighbor Carol Reed, shaking her head in disbelief when news of their deaths spread. "No one had a bad word to say about them. I can't even begin to imagine who would want to harm Paul and Martha. It doesn't make any sense." But as investigators delved deeper into Paul and Martha's lives, a different portrait began to emerge. Beneath the seemingly perfect veneer of the Klein family were threads of tension that had been quietly fraying for years. Their son Michael, now in his mid-30s, had always been a source of concern. While Paul and Martha had worked tirelessly to build a life that was modest but proud, Michael had taken a different path. Michael's troubles were well known around Meadow Ridge. He had dropped out of college in his early 20s, bouncing between jobs and living paycheck to paycheck. Though he had a charm about him that some found endearing, his impulsive decisions and lack of direction painted a stark contrast against his parents' steady, disciplined lives. Over the years, rumors swirled about Michael's financial troubles, credit card debt, gambling, and too many failed get-rich-quick schemes to count. He always seemed to circle back to his parents when he was in trouble, explained Sheriff Wade Harrison, reflecting on his early suspicions. Paul and Martha were the type who would give him their last dollar if he asked, but there's only so much you can do before you start to draw a line. That line, it seemed, had been crossed just weeks before the Kleins were killed. Investigators uncovered a tense chain of events that had escalated within the family. Michael had approached his parents about a business investment he claimed was a guaranteed sure thing. He needed $50,000, a massive ask for anyone, but especially for Paul and Martha, whose life savings were tied up in their land, their modest retirement fund, and a savings account they rarely dipped into. Paul, ever practical, had refused. It wasn't the first time, according to close friends of the family. "Paul loved his boy, there's no question about that," said Charlie Mills, one of Paul's fishing buddies, "but you could tell he was worn down. Michael had a way of showing up only when things got rough for him, and you could see it broke Paul's heart to keep saying no. I think he figured that sometimes love means not giving in." Martha, always the softer of the two, had tried to mediate, but tensions remained. When Paul and Martha didn't show up for church the Sunday before their bodies were discovered, it struck everyone as unusual. Martha never missed the chance to sing in the choir, and Paul always took the opportunity to catch up with neighbors over coffee after the service. Some assumed they were simply off visiting family or dealing with farm matters, but the silence stretched longer than anyone expected. When Edgar stumbled upon their bodies in the old barn, the discovery shattered the image everyone had of the Kleins, the dependable, kind-hearted couple who were invincible in the eyes of their small town. The sight of their lifeless forms, hidden under the dusty tarp as if they were nothing more than forgotten tools, haunted the sheriff and his deputies. "This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong," Sheriff Harrison told the assembled press, his voice grave. "This was personal. Whoever did this didn't just want their money, they had a reason to target Paul and Martha." The town of Meadow Ridge quickly turned introspective. Neighbors gathered in living rooms whispering theories about what might have happened. Was it someone passing through, a drifter? Some speculated. Others, however, turned their gaze closer to home. What about Michael? they murmured under their breath. He's been nothing but trouble for years. The first clue. The family's finances cleaned out. As the sun set over the small Texas town of Meadow Ridge, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, Sheriff Wade Harrison sat hunched over a pile of financial documents in his dimly lit office. The initial crime scene investigation had provided little in the way of solid leads. There were no obvious signs of struggle in the barn, no footprints or stray fibers that would point directly to a suspect. But one thing quickly became crystal clear after the crime techs delved into Paul and Martha Klein's accounts. Their finances had been completely wiped out. The discovery hit like a bucket of cold water. Paul and Martha weren't the kind of people who made extravagant purchases or dipped into their savings frivolously. Every penny they had tucked away was the product of decades of hard work. Their modest savings account, rarely touched aside from emergencies, hadn't just been accessed, it had been systematically drained. Nearly $120,000 disappeared in a matter of days leading up to their deaths. Whoever had done this wasn't just a killer, they were calculated, deliberate, and deeply familiar with the Klein's financial situation. Sheriff Harrison rubbed the bridge of his nose and leaned back in his chair as Deputy Rachel Diaz silently placed another folder on his desk. Her face mirrored the unease settling over the small department since this case had come across their desks. "We pulled the bank records and got in touch with the branch manager," she began, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "Looks like the withdrawals were made in person at 2 locations, once in Dallas and once in a smaller branch closer to the county line. Both times they used Martha's name." "How recent?" Harrison asked, flipping through the folder and scanning the details. "The first withdrawal was 3 days before the last confirmed sighting of the Kleins at the general store," Rachel replied. "The second, just a day after they were killed." Harrison frowned, letting out a low whistle. "You mean to tell me someone took their money after they were already lying dead in that barn?" Rachel hesitated before nodding. "Looks that way. And get this, they didn't just empty the savings. Whoever did this transferred a total of $80,000 into another account shortly after the second withdrawal. We're still trying to trace where that money's gone. I've already requested the bank footage, but since it's a smaller operation, we'll be lucky if they've got cameras covering anything other than the ATM." This financial trail painted a chilling picture. Whoever murdered Paul and Martha hadn't just stumbled into the scene on a whim. They planned it. They knew which bank to hit, knew how to access the couple's account, and perhaps most disturbingly, seemed to know how long they could operate before anyone caught on. The level of precision suggested that this wasn't random. "Could it have been someone close to them?" Rachel asked cautiously, breaking the silence. Harrison didn't respond right away. He tapped on the edge of the desk with his pen as the jagged edges of a theory began to form. The Kleins weren't the sort to share their financial details freely. Their neighbors, after all, probably wouldn't even know how much they had tucked away. This wasn't the work of a stranger, it had the personal fingerprints of someone they trusted. "Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves," he finally muttered, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his words. He pushed up from his chair, grabbed the file and motioned for Rachel to follow him. "Come on, we need to pay the bank manager a visit first thing tomorrow morning." When Harrison and Rachel walked into the Meadow Ridge Bank branch the following morning, Cheryl Hamilton, the kindly manager who'd known the Kleins for years, greeted them with wide eyes and a tense smile. At the mention of their names, her expression faltered. "I couldn't believe it when I heard what happened," she murmured, wringing her hands. "Paul and Martha, they were just the nicest." "We're sorry to interrupt, ma'am, but we need access to withdrawal records and any footage you might have from earlier this month," interjected Harrison gently but firmly. "It looks like whoever did this either had access to Martha's banking information or was very good at forging her signature." Cheryl's face flushed. Of course. I'd be happy to help in any way I can. We were all so shocked when those withdrawals came through. Martha usually preferred to handle most transactions in person, and she'd never taken out so much at once before." "Do you remember her coming in?" Rachel asked, catching on to the subtle doubt in Cheryl's voice. "Well, I thought it was her. It was her ID after all," Cheryl said uncertainly. She shifted uncomfortably, as if suddenly second-guessing the interaction. "But now that I think about it, I don't remember her being quite as chatty as usual. Something seemed off. I didn't want to pry, but the way she kept those sunglasses on the whole time struck me as a little strange. It was a warm day, no real reason to keep them on indoors." Rachel and Harrison exchanged a glance. It wasn't uncommon in rural towns like Meadow Ridge for transactions to rely on trust and familiarity, rather than scrutinizing ID photos closely. But in hindsight, Cheryl's gut feeling carried weight. "What about the second withdrawal? Did you see her for that one?" Harrison pressed. "No, that one happened at the Dallas branch," Cheryl explained. "But the accounts were all interconnected, so there wasn't anything flagged automatically, at least not at first." "Do you have footage from the withdrawal here?" Rachel asked. Cheryl nodded. "It's not the best quality, but we can pull it up." Minutes later, Harrison and Rachel stared intently at a grainy black-and-white image from Meadow Ridge Bank's lobby cameras. The figure who claimed to be Martha Klein was shrouded in shadow from a broad-brimmed hat and oversized sunglasses, her features nearly indiscernible. Rachel leaned closer to the screen. "I can't tell if that's her or not." Harrison's jaw tightened. "It's not. Look at the posture. Martha walked upright, always squared her shoulders. This person's trying too hard to blend in." "Someone younger then," Rachel murmured, almost to herself. "Someone who had access to her identification," Harrison added grimly. As they left the bank later that day, Harrison's mind reeled with questions. If the stranger impersonating Martha wasn't her, then who was it? And more disturbingly, how far would they have been willing to go to secure that money? A knock came later that evening, delivering another piece of the puzzle. The signature on the withdrawal slips matched Martha's unmistakably. Too perfectly. It was clear now, someone close, possibly even family, had pulled this off. The primary suspect, the only son of the couple. By the time Sheriff Wade Harrison left the bank that evening, the uneasy murmur of one name followed him like a shadow: Michael Klein. Michael had always been the Klein's only child, their pride and joy. Yet, as investigators began to peel back the layers of his life, it became clear that pride had long since been replaced by worry, disappointment, and eventually silence. Michael wasn't a stranger to trouble. Small-town gossip had circled around him for years, and while his parents had done their best to protect him, they couldn't shield him from everything. Like many in Meadow Ridge, Michael had grown up on his family's modest farm, helping out with chores and learning the value of hard work from his father. But where Paul was steady and dependable, Michael was restless, hungry for something bigger than what his tiny hometown could offer. After graduating high school, he'd left Meadow Ridge to attend college, a decision many in the town admired. "He's gonna make something of himself," people would often say, proud of their local boy. But Michael's college years were short-lived. "I remember when he came back," said Carol Reed, the Klein's neighbor, during an interview with the police. "It was sudden. He was supposed to be off getting an education, but within a year he was back home acting like nothing had happened." Michael never finished his degree. Reports of missed classes, mounting student debt, and what some described as a penchant for partying came trickling back to the Kleins. Out of money and out of options, he returned to the place he had once sworn to escape, Meadow Ridge. For a while, things seemed to settle down. Michael got odd jobs, working as a mechanic, tending bar in a neighboring town, but he never seemed to stay in one place for long. "He was charming," Carol added. "He could talk his way into just about anything. That's probably why people kept giving him chances even when he didn't deserve them." But along with charm came a darker, more troubling side. Gambling debts began to pile up, and whispers of business deals gone bad reached his parents' ears. Paul and Martha, ever protective, stood by their son publicly. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. Investigators uncovered what many in the town of Meadow Ridge had chosen to ignore. Michael had developed a pattern over the years, borrowing money, making lofty promises to pay it back, and then finding himself unable to deliver. Usually he'd come crawling back to his parents, and for much of his 20s, they obliged. But as the years wore on, Paul and Martha began to draw boundaries. "It wasn't easy for them," said Charlie Mills, Paul's fishing buddy. "Paul would vent sometimes when we were out on the water. He'd say things like, 'I want to help him, but every time I do it's like throwing money into a pit.' It broke his heart, but even he knew enough was enough." Those boundaries, however, didn't sit well with Michael. When friends and acquaintances refused to lend him money, his desperation eventually turned to rage. He'd blow up at people, a former co-worker recounted. "Real charming one minute, angry and unpredictable the next. You learned to keep your wallet close when Michael was around." In the weeks leading up to the murders, tension in the Klein family had reached a boiling point. Multiple friends of the Kleins remembered Michael trying to pitch what he called a killer opportunity. He wanted $50,000, an astronomical sum for his small-town parents, whose savings were tied to their modest farm. On several occasions, Michael visited his parents at home, attempting to sweet-talk them into financing his latest scheme, though no one could recall what kind of investment it was supposed to fund. Paul refused. A proud and practical man, He knew better than to throw away the hard-earned savings intended for his and Martha's future. "He didn't want to be the bad guy," said Charlie Mills. "I think it absolutely gutted him to have to tell his son no, but Paul wasn't going to let Michael jeopardize what little they had managed to save after years of backbreaking work." Martha, ever the peacemaker, tried to mediate, but witnesses later reported that even she had grown reluctant. "She would break down in tears," Carol Reed remembered. "Michael didn't just ask, he demanded, and when he didn't get his way, well, she used to say he scared her sometimes." One of the most ominous accounts came from the Klein's pastor, Reverend Thompson. "They were such faithful church members," he recalled, "but the last few times I spoke to Martha she seemed distracted. I asked her if everything was all right and she just sort of smiled and said, 'Oh, you know, family stuff.'" Those who saw Michael during this time described him as increasingly erratic. He spent more time away from Meadow Ridge, particularly in Dallas, though no one seemed to know what he was doing there. Rumors swirled. Some said he was gambling, others claimed he had fallen into debt with some dangerous people, but none of it could be confirmed. When investigators learned about the missing money from the Klein's bank accounts, the pieces started coming together. "This changed everything," said Sheriff Harrison, pacing the station as he addressed his team. "Michael knew about his parents' savings. He knew about the safety net they'd built for themselves after years of hard work. Everyone knew how persistent he could be when he wanted something. And then there's the withdrawal records, the timing of it all. It doesn't feel like a coincidence." Harrison leaned on his desk, sighing as if the weight of the realization had settled firmly on his shoulders. If Michael was strapped for cash, if he was desperate enough— "Desperate people do desperate things," Rachel finished the thought, her voice low but steady. The scent of betrayal, tinged with desperation and greed, hung heavy in the air as investigators began closing in on Michael as their prime suspect. A quiet unease fell over Meadow Ridge as the truth sank in. The Klein's tragedy might not have been caused by a faceless drifter or an outsider. It might have come from within. As Harrison stared at the photo of Michael taken years earlier, his boyish grin exuding charm and confidence, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. In another life, Michael could have been Meadow Ridge's proud success story. Instead, his face would soon become a symbol of heartbreak, of what happens when ambition, pride, and desperation collide in the worst possible way. The chase begins with suspicions mounting and Michael nowhere to be found. The investigation shifted gears. His name was officially added to the list of persons of interest, and for the first time in decades, Meadow Ridge prepared itself for the possibility that one of its own could have committed the unthinkable. The chase for Michael and his young wife. The moment Michael Klein's name first appeared as a suspect in the murders of Paul and Martha Klein, Sheriff Wade Harrison's gut instinct told him that catching the man wouldn't be simple. People like Michael, even in small towns, had a way of slipping through cracks, finding loopholes, disappearing into the void. What no one had expected, however, was that Michael wouldn't be running alone. By the time investigators put his name on the suspect list, Michael and Jessica, his 28-year-old wife, were already gone. By all accounts, Jessica Klein was something of an outsider in Meadow Ridge. She'd come into Michael's life unexpectedly a little over 3 years earlier, blonde-haired, bright-eyed, and carrying the air of a woman itching for something bigger than what the dusty Texas plains had to offer. Locals never entirely warmed to her, describing her as cold and materialistic, more interested in ambition than the down-home generosity that Meadow Ridge prided itself on. Jessica was high-strung. "Let's just put it that way," said Carol Reed during a later police interview. "Ever since Michael brought her back here, things just felt off. He practically worshipped the ground she walked on, but everyone else saw it for what it was. She was trouble." Jessica didn't grow up with much, and those who knew her from her younger years claimed that she'd always tried to reinvent herself. She wanted nicer clothes, a bigger house, fancier vacations, and she didn't have much patience for waiting. "She wasn't the type to sit around and hope for the best," explained Deputy Rachel Diaz, flipping through Jessica's social media history. She didn't hide her frustration with small-town life, even posted sarcastic captions about the farm vibe from time to time. What's clear is that whatever her dreams were, they didn't involve Meadow Ridge or staying tied to Michael's family's legacy. Jessica's influence on Michael became a matter of scrutiny, as investigators pieced together the timeline leading up to the murders. Friends and neighbors of the Kleins recalled numerous occasions when Jessica voiced her frustration. "It's embarrassing," she allegedly told a friend. "Michael deserves more than hand-me-down farm life, and so do I." When word broke out that Michael and Jessica were gone, vanished just days after the murders, It confirmed Sheriff Harrison's suspicion. They were on the run, and they weren't going to make it easy for anyone to track them down. "What's your gut tell you?" Rachel asked as she filed through a stack of anonymous tips that had poured in during the first week. "My gut tells me they've got a head start, and we've got two people who don't plan on turning themselves in anytime soon," Harrison muttered, staring down at a map of Texas spread across his desk. "Michael knows his way around, and Jessica, my guess is she's the brains running this operation." The first lead in their escape came from a surveillance camera at a gas station near Waco, Texas. The footage, time-stamped just 48 hours after the bodies of Paul and Martha were discovered, showed a tan SUV pulling up to the pump. The man stepping out to fuel the car was unmistakably Michael Klein. His face was partially obscured, a baseball cap pulled low to shadow his features, but Harrison recognized him instantly. More telling, however, was the passenger seat. Next to Michael sat Jessica, peering anxiously out the window as if expecting every passing vehicle to be a police cruiser. From Waco, the trail went cold. For a while, investigators knew they couldn't have gotten far without money, so tracking the couple's financial activity became the next priority. It didn't take long to discover that Jessica, in all her ambition, wasn't exactly skilled at subtlety. Credit card records showed that multiple purchases had been made in her name at motels and diners along Interstate 35, pushing steadily north into Oklahoma and Arkansas. "She's not trying to lay low," Rachel said, tapping the records as she laid them out on Harrison's desk. "This woman's buying clothes, eating at mid-level restaurants. Hell, she even picked up a pair of earrings somewhere near Little Rock." "Michael might be trying to blend in, but Jessica?" Harrison shook his head. "She can't resist being noticed." It was more than a spending trail that gave investigators insight into their movements. Michael and Jessica's relationship, as idyllic as it might have seemed on the surface, two young people in love, united by a rebellious streak, had begun to fracture under the weight of their shared crimes. Witnesses in Arkansas recalled seeing the couple at a motel just outside Hot Springs, arguing loudly in the parking lot. The manager described Jessica storming off, shouting something about not dragging her into this mess, while Michael followed, red-faced and visibly tense. "They'll tear each other apart before we even get to them," Harrison remarked when the report came in. "It's only a matter of time before that dynamic swings out of control." Sure enough, another clue arrived less than a week later. A state trooper in Tennessee reported a sighting of Jessica alone at a convenience store. She'd used cash to make her purchases, but surveillance footage caught her arguing over the phone before storming out. Investigators traced the call back to a burner phone registered to Michael. "She's getting tired of running," Rachel noted, reviewing the images with Harrison. "And Michael, I don't think this is the life he promised her." "They're realizing they're different people when things get real," Harrison replied. "Jessica thought she was marrying someone who could give her everything. Now she's stuck with the guy who gambled away his parents' trust, and he's dragging it all behind them like a ball and chain." The breaking point came at a motel in rural Arkansas, where police found more than just Jessica's fingerprints. By the time investigators arrived, the scene was another nightmare reminiscent of the barn where the story had begun. Jessica and a man named Adam Hayes, who detectives believed to be a drifter Jessica met along the way, were both found dead. A spent handgun rested on the bed, the room reeking of metal and anger. The evidence told a clear story. Michael had returned to find Jessica and Adam together. Whatever simmering tensions had built between Michael and Jessica had boiled over into an unthinkable act of violence. "This guy's unraveling," Harrison muttered as he stared at photos from the scene. "First his parents, now his wife. This is turning into a deadly mixture of greed, betrayal, and revenge." Michael Klein was no longer just a fugitive on the run. Now, he was a suspected spree killer, a dangerous man with nothing left to lose. And Harrison knew one thing for certain: wherever Michael was going next, he would leave destruction in his wake. The calculated plan behind the crime. From the very beginning, Sheriff Wade Harrison had a nagging feeling that this wasn't a crime of spontaneity. The scene, the timing, the methodical withdrawals from Paul and Martha Klein's bank accounts, it all pointed to something disturbingly meticulous. This wasn't just an act of rage or desperation. There was a sinister plan hiding beneath the grim surface of the crime. And the more clues Harrison and his team uncovered, the more it became clear that Michael Klein wasn't just a suspect, he was the architect of the entire tragedy. As Harrison sat in his office, scribbling notes on a legal pad late one night, he tried to piece it all together. What kind of person would have the patience, the cold calculation, to dismantle their own family's life savings and then take their lives without hesitation? This wasn't a crime committed on a whim. Whoever orchestrated it had spent weeks, if not months, mapping out every detail. And in a town like Meadow Ridge, where everyone knew everybody else's business, that level of secrecy was no small feat. He knew what he was doing, Harrison said aloud to himself, leaning back in his chair. Every move he made was deliberate. The plan began to take shape as investigators re-examined every piece of evidence, every interaction Michael had with his parents in the weeks leading up to the murder. They discovered that Michael had lied to Paul and Martha to lure them away from the safety of their farm. Under the pretense of discussing a dispute over inherited land with an attorney, Michael had convinced his parents to meet him at the old rundown barn on the outskirts of Meadow Ridge, an isolated spot no one visited anymore. Martha, ever the peacekeeper, had insisted they accompany Michael despite Paul's initial reluctance. He knew exactly where to take them, Deputy Rachel Diaz noted as the team pored over the timeline. That barn was way out there, tucked behind those old cornfields. Nobody would have heard a thing. The autopsy reports revealed further chilling details. Both Paul and Martha had been killed swiftly and efficiently. The weapon, a serrated hunting knife that was later recovered near the scene, suggested the murders were both premeditated and personal. But it was Michael's cold, calculated actions after the killings that truly horrified the investigators. Immediately following the murders, Michael had taken Martha's purse, which contained her ID and banking information. He'd also taken Paul's truck, an old but reliable pickup that blended right into the Texas backroads. Michael's next move had been to drive over 150 miles to a bank near Dallas, where he made the first withdrawal of $40,000 from his parents' joint savings account. Wearing sunglasses and a cap to obscure his face, he'd used Martha's ID and forged her signature with precision. Bank tellers, familiar with rural politeness, hadn't thought twice about an older woman's signature on the withdrawal slip. What baffled Harrison and his team was just how confident Michael had been. He hadn't rushed the transaction. He even made small talk with the staff, according to one teller's later testimony. He didn't seem nervous at all, she admitted when questioned. He just said he and his wife were planning a big move to Florida and needed to start moving some things around. Calm as ice, Harrison muttered after hanging up the phone. He knew most people wouldn't question him, especially in a small town. Michael didn't stop there. A day after leaving the barn, he visited a second bank closer to home, withdrawing another $40,000. This time, he was careful to choose a branch that was less likely to have detailed surveillance footage. Investigators later found that the moved roughly 40,000. This time, he was careful to choose a branch that was less likely to have detailed surveillance footage. Investigators later found that they'd moved roughly 80,000 into a separate account registered under a fake name. Tracking that money had become a steep challenge for the team, but it was clear Michael intended to use it to fund his escape. The deeper they dug, the more meticulous the plan revealed itself to be. Michael had prepared false identities for both himself and Jessica. Investigators uncovered a stash of fake driver's licenses, credit cards, and even social security numbers when they searched abandoned motel rooms the couple had been using during their run. Jessica, for all her impulsiveness, had played her part as well. With her sharp, material aspirations, she worked alongside Michael to transfer funds, ensuring they would have enough cash and resources to stay mobile for months, even years. She's not just some clueless wife going along for the ride, Rachel said, shaking her head as she looked over the evidence. Jessica was in this up to her neck. Despite their best efforts, however, Michael's plan wasn't flawless. His own arrogance had begun to unravel the web he'd so carefully spun. Investigators noted how reckless Jessica had been with their expenditures, leaving breadcrumbs wherever they ran. From purchasing designer sunglasses in Arkansas to booking rooms at mid-range hotels in her own name, she'd inadvertently undermined Michael's carefully laid foundation. "This isn't the work of a mastermind," Harrison said with a wry chuckle, picking up a photo of the couple spotted at a gas station in Waco. "It's the work of a man desperate enough to believe he could pull off the perfect crime." The final piece of the plan's sinister nature came to light when Harrison interviewed Jessica's old acquaintances. She had reportedly pressured Michael to hasten their plans after losing patience with his constant failures. It turned out that Jessica had been frustrated with the slow progress of their supposed windfall. Her dissatisfaction had escalated into demands. She pushed him, one friend confessed. She said, "It's now or never," and Michael finally caved. This new detail painted a heartbreaking, horrifying picture of how greed and ambition could tear apart even the strongest of family ties. Paul and Martha had died because their son and his wife believed they were entitled to everything, the money, the freedom, and a second chance at the life they wanted. And in their minds, nothing could stand in their way. As Harrison stared at the timeline pinned to the board in his office, one thing became clear. This was never about just the money. It was about power, control, and a warped sense of entitlement. Michael's meticulous plan hadn't just robbed his parents of their lives, it had robbed their community of its innocence. "You know what the worst part is, Rachel?" Harrison said softly as they worked late into the night. He probably convinced himself he was the victim in all this. In his mind it wasn't about betrayal or greed, it probably felt justified. Rachel looked up from her notes, her face grim. "Well," she said, "justified or not, his perfect plan's starting to fall apart, and when we catch him, perfect is the last thing he's going to feel." Jessica's lavish lifestyle. The key to cracking the case. Jessica Klein was something of an enigma to the people of Meadow Ridge. In a town where modesty and hard work were the cornerstones of life, she stood out like a diamond in a haystack, one that some said sparkled just a little too much. From the moment Michael introduced her to the community, it was clear that Jessica wasn't interested in blending in. Her polished nails, carefully curated outfits, and clipped way of speaking gave her an air of someone who thought Meadow Ridge, its people, its small-town simplicity, was beneath her. She didn't belong here, Carol Reed, the Klein's longtime neighbor, told investigators. It wasn't just the way she dressed or acted, it was her attitude. She always had this look, like she was waiting for someone to rescue her from this nothing of a town. Jessica didn't grow up in wealth. By all accounts, she came from humble beginnings in a neighboring state, a town not much different from Meadow Ridge. But she'd always had bigger aspirations. High school friends remembered her as ambitious to a fault, someone who dreamed of marrying rich and escaping her boring small-town upbringing. In many ways, Michael fit the mold of what she was used to. Small-time charm, a streak of trouble, but with a hint of untapped potential. What Jessica underestimated, however, was how far that potential would take them, or how it would drag her into something far darker than she'd bargained for. "She made no effort to hide her frustration," said Rachel Diaz, deputy sheriff, scrolling through Jessica's social media profiles from the months leading up to the murders. She'd complain online about the town, about the struggles of scraping by, even about Michael's failures. It was as if the filter she used to hide her life offline vanished when she got behind a keyboard. Jessica's spending habits stood in stark contrast to the life she and Michael supposedly led. Despite having no steady income, she managed to maintain a veneer of luxury that drew quiet judgment from the Meadow Ridge locals. Designer handbags, tailored dresses, spa weekends in Dallas, all inexplicably woven into a life that, on paper at least, should have been modest at best. "This one time," Carol went on, "she showed up at the feed store, you know, where we all went for farm supplies, wearing high heels and a leather jacket that must have cost more than my entire wardrobe. It was laughable. I couldn't help but think, where's that money coming from? She wasn't even working." The truth behind Jessica's indulgences became startlingly clear as the investigation unfolded. As early as 6 months before Paul and Martha's deaths, Jessica had begun pushing Michael harder, urging him to do whatever it took to elevate their standing. Bank records showed that small, unexplained withdrawals from Paul and Martha's savings account had started trickling out long before the fatal confrontation at the barn. Initially, these withdrawals appeared minor, 200 here, 200 here, 300 there, but they were eerily regular. By the time of the murders, the Klein's account had been bled dry. She wasn't just spending big, she was reckless, Rachel noted. Spa treatments, jewelry, designer shoes. Most people trying to lay low wouldn't even think of flashing money around like this, but Jessica, she didn't care. What investigators began to piece together was as much a psychological profile as it was a financial trail. Jessica's thirst for glamour and escape from farm life blinded her to the dangers surrounding her. What little restraint Michael might have had dissolved under her influence. Friends of the couple reported that Jessica was not only aware of Michael's financial burdens, but actively fueled his dangerous spiral. She manipulated him, Reverend Thompson, pastor of the Klein's church, later claimed. Michael already had problems, but Jessica, she knew how to push him. She knew how to make him feel small, like he wasn't good enough. I think she saw those savings as her one-way ticket out of this life, and she didn't care who paid the price. Jessica's role in the aftermath of the murders was as much a liability to the couple's escape as it was the key to unraveling their crime. Her need for comfort and luxury proved destructive. Credit card records showed that, Even while on the run, she couldn't resist booking mid-tier hotel rooms, indulging in shopping sprees, and dining at restaurants far too conspicuous for a couple who just committed the kind of crime that warranted staying under the radar. "She left a trail of breadcrumbs like she wanted to be caught," said Harrison, shaking his head as he rifled through receipts found in Michael and Jessica's abandoned motel room in Arkansas. "She wasn't just careless, she was arrogant. It's like she thought they were untouchable." The couple's lavish lifestyle, funded by stolen money, painted an ironic picture. In Oklahoma, surveillance cameras caught Jessica strolling out of a boutique wearing sunglasses with a designer tag still dangling from one arm, her head tilted upward as if she were untouchable. In Arkansas, witnesses remembered her haggling over prices with a motel clerk, demanding a higher-class room. In Tennessee, a state trooper spotted her filling a shopping cart at a convenience store, not with necessities, but with cosmetic products and snacks that seemed absurd for fugitives avoiding capture. Jessica loved being seen, Rachel noted, and that's exactly what made her their downfall. Jessica's overt behavior wasn't just a liability, it became the crack in the facade investigators needed to close in on them. Witness testimonies from Arkansas reported loud fights between Michael and Jessica, with one notable encounter outside a cheap diner. Jessica had yelled, within earshot of several customers, about how tired she was of living like this, and how she'd never signed up for his plan. Her words immediately caught the attention of Michael, who reportedly stormed out, leaving Jessica behind. That particular argument, coupled with receipts from nearby stores, allowed investigators to track their drift across state lines, ultimately helping them map every step of their escape. "She thought she was untouchable," Harrison added. "But in the end, Jessica didn't understand what it truly meant to run. She couldn't let go of the lifestyle, the money, or her need for control, and that cost her everything." Jessica's role in the crime raised grave questions about intention versus consequence. Did she mastermind a plot, or had she twisted Michael's weakness into something lethal? Her reckless spending and tendency to draw attention to herself exposed her arrogance, but it also underscored her desperation. A woman who had spent so long chasing wealth, comfort, and success had turned into a key figure in her own tragic downfall. Worse yet, her unquenchable greed and ambition indirectly led to her own death at the hands of Michael, whose jealousy and frustration finally boiled over. As Sheriff Harrison reviewed her trail once more, bank accounts drained, luxury items flaunted, receipts found in motels, it was clear Jessica's unapologetic, lavish lifestyle wasn't just a footnote in the investigation. It had written the very blueprint for her capture and sealed her fate. Tensions arise between the couple on the run. Michael and Jessica Klein hit the road with every intention of evading justice, but what they couldn't escape was each other. The same whirlwind dynamic that had once fueled their relationship, her fiery determination and his desperate charm, began to crumble under the weight of their shared crime. The same partnership that Michael thought would hold them together started to fracture, piece by piece, as their flight became more desperate and the consequences of their actions unraveled further. They didn't just run from the law, they ran right into their own mess, Sheriff Wade Harrison would later say, shaking his head as he recounted the dynamics between the couple. From the first day of their escape, tensions simmered below the surface. Jessica, unused to anything less than comfort, grew frustrated by the makeshift conditions of life on the run. Cheap motels with threadbare sheets, gas station meals eaten in the cab of an old truck, long hours on back roads with no destination in sight. It wasn't the glamorous life she had envisioned, and the cracks began to show. They were doomed from the minute they hit the road, Rachel Diaz, Harrison's deputy, said as she sifted through witness accounts. Jessica wasn't built to stay hidden. She wasn't built for sacrifice. Everything about her screamed, "I need the world to see me." That doesn't mix well with being a fugitive. In Arkansas, a witness at a roadside motel described seeing Michael and Jessica arguing loudly outside their room. The manager, who later shared her account with the police, remembered Jessica pacing back and forth, arms crossed, while Michael stood with his head hung low, visibly exhausted. She kept saying something about how this wasn't the plan, and how he had promised her it would be better than this, the manager recalled. I don't know what they were running from, but it was clear that they weren't on the same page anymore. Jessica's dissatisfaction with Michael wasn't just about the rough conditions of their escape. It was about control. For years she had pushed Michael into schemes, into making bold moves that always seemed to promise something bigger than their current circumstances. But now that they were on the run, scraping by and living out of a suitcase, it dawned on her that she had hitched her future to a man with no real plan. She started blaming him, Rachel noted. A lot of the witnesses said she'd yell things like, "You're useless," or, "Why did I ever trust you?" That was her pattern. She propped him up when she needed him, but tore him down the second things got hard. Michael, for his part, wasn't as immune to the pressure as he might have seemed. Witnesses described him as irritable and easily agitated, his trademark charm dissolving into frustration. Surveillance footage from a convenience store in Tennessee showed the cracks in real time. Jessica, dressed in her usual over-the-top style for someone trying to avoid being seen, can be seen rolling her eyes as Michael, visibly upset, gestured wildly in her direction. At one point she crossed her arms and turned her back on him while he continued to argue. By the time they reached northern Arkansas, the fights had escalated. Jessica, ever the spender, couldn't resist dipping into the remaining stolen funds for her own comforts. Cosmetic items, boutique finds, nicer motel rooms than the bare minimum Michael thought they'd need to stay off the radar. Each transaction became a source of conflict. Michael, already paranoid that their spending was leaving a trail for the police, lashed out over her perceived recklessness. "You can't keep spending," he reportedly shouted during one argument overheard by a fellow motel guest. "Do you want to get us caught?" Her retort was sharp-edged, laced with frustration. "Do you want me to look like some fugitive slob? Maybe you're fine with hiding in shadows like a rat, but I have standards." Their relationship, which had once been a precarious balance of Jessica's ambition and Michael's desperation to keep up, was now a volatile cocktail of blame, resentment, and fear. Each clash drew them further apart, making it clear to law enforcement that their dynamic was breaking down. They weren't a team anymore, Harrison explained to a press outlet. Whatever idea of partnership they'd once had was gone. Now it was about survival, and they each wanted it on their own terms. Jessica's dissatisfaction boiled over during one of their final stops in Arkansas. Witnesses at a diner claimed the couple erupted into a public argument in the parking lot. Jessica, visibly fed up and not bothering to lower her voice, accused Michael of being a failure and ruining her life. "This isn't what I signed up for," she shouted. A nearby customer remembered Michael's reaction vividly, silent at first, his body rigid, before finally snapping back, "Well, maybe you should have stayed behind." That moment would prove to be a turning point. Michael stormed off and left Jessica in the parking lot, slamming the truck door behind him and speeding off. "When people start turning on each other, that's when mistakes happen," Rachel said, reflecting on the fight. "And that's exactly what we were hoping for." Jessica didn't stay put for long, but investigators pieced together that the seeds of distrust had already been planted. At their next known stop, a rundown motel near Little Rock, the situation took a deadly turn. When law enforcement finally arrived after being tipped off by motel staff about a disturbance, they found Jessica and a man named Adam Hayes dead. Hayes, believed to be a drifter Jessica had connected with during one of her angry departures from Michael, had been shot alongside her in what could only be described as a crime of passion. The room was torn apart, broken glass, overturned furniture, and traces of a violent struggle. "What we saw in that hotel room, it was chaos," Harrison recounted grimly. "Someone had clearly lost control, and we knew exactly who it was." It didn't take long to connect the dots back to Michael. Their tensions had reached a boiling point, and with Jessica gone and the stolen money starting to dry up, investigators knew Michael had run out of things to hold on to. They weren't just running from the law, Harrison later said. They were running from everything that was broken between them, but no matter how far they ran, they couldn't escape the mess they'd made of each other. The next murder at a remote motel. A week into their chaotic run from the law, any illusion of control that Michael Klein had clung to was long gone. What had started as a calculated plan to escape justice had spiraled into something darker and far more twisted. The next tragic chapter in this story unfolded in a remote, run-down motel just outside Little Rock, Arkansas, a setting as grim as the events that would take place there. Sheriff Wade Harrison would later describe the scene as a boiling point, the moment when all the tension, desperation, and fury that Michael had bottled up finally exploded. "It was only a matter of time," Harrison said. "You could see it coming from a mile out. There was no way someone like Michael, on the run with no safety net, no backup plan, was going to hold it together forever." The details of what led up to the bloodbath at the motel were pieced together from witness accounts and crime scene evidence, but the complete story would forever remain shrouded in mystery. What investigators did know was that in the days before the murders, Michael and Jessica's volatile relationship had hit rock bottom. Tensions between the two had been simmering for weeks, bubbling over into explosive fights witnessed by motel guests, gas station attendants, and diner servers across multiple states. Jessica's frustrations with their fugitive lifestyle, cheap food, dingy motels, constant paranoia, had reached a breaking point, and Michael's patience for her complaints was wearing thin. She wanted out, Deputy Rachel Diaz explained as she worked through the timeline with Harrison. Jessica was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of Michael. Everything she thought she'd get out of this plan had turned into ashes, and she wasn't afraid to make it known. The Little Rock Motel was a forgotten establishment, the kind of place that sat on the side of highways most people didn't think twice about. Faded paint peeled off the rickety structure, and a flickering neon sign reading, "Vacancy," buzzed quietly in the humid Arkansas night. The Kleins checked in late, as they often did, under yet another set of fake names. This time, it wasn't long before trouble started brewing. They were fighting, loudly, said Marlene Jenkins, the tired-looking desk clerk who worked the night shift that evening. You could hear it clear as day from the front desk, even with their door shut. She was yelling about being done with it all, how she'd made a mistake, trusting him. He was yelling back, but you couldn't catch as much of what he was saying. It was muffled, angrier. What happened after that first argument remains uncertain, but investigators believe Jessica stormed out of the motel to cool off. What was unusual, though, was that she didn't return alone. By the early hours of the morning, she had been joined by a man named Adam Hayes, a drifter staying in a nearby room who, according to witnesses, had struck up a conversation with Jessica at the motel vending machine. Adam Hayes wasn't a large figure in the investigation until his name appeared on Jessica's lips. Motive tied him into the sequence of events, but his backstory would prove he was, in many ways, just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was just a drifter, maybe with a criminal past, Harrison explained. We don't know how much he knew about Jessica's situation, but somehow she dragged him right into the middle of it. From what could be gathered, Jessica and Adam returned to her motel room sometime after midnight. Witnesses along the motel balcony overheard laughter, the clinking of glasses, and music playing faintly in the background. For the first time in weeks, Jessica seemed more at ease. But it was the calm before the storm. By 3 a.m., everything had unraveled. The calm had been shattered by Michael's return to the room, and with it came pure chaos. A neighboring guest later recounted hearing the door to Jessica's room slam open, followed by the unmistakable sound of angry shouting. Michael's voice, distinct in its fury, cut through the night. He was screaming something like, "What the hell are you doing?" And, "I knew you'd do this," the guest, a man named Chuck Taylor, told authorities. Then it got quieter, like they were arguing in hushed tones. But about 10 minutes later, that's when the gunshots started. The scene inside the motel room was nothing short of horrific when law enforcement arrived. Jessica and Adam were both dead. Adam slumped over a broken nightstand, a bullet wound in his chest, and Jessica sprawled across the bed, a gunshot to her stomach. Blood pooled under the motel's cheap patterned rug, and the room itself looked like it had been turned upside down during the struggle. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, and torn fabric told the story of a fight that escalated beyond control. A handgun lay discarded on the floor near Jessica. It would later be confirmed as the weapon that ended both lives. This wasn't random. It wasn't opportunistic. This was personal, Harrison said of the scene. Michael walked into that room with two emotions, jealousy and rage. Whatever he found there was enough to push him over the edge. And when Michael lets his emotions take the driver's seat, people don't survive it. Michael, as he always did, ran. By the time motel staff called the authorities, he was already gone, leaving another mess of death and destruction in his wake. Security cameras caught a grainy image of him speeding out of the parking lot in the stolen truck, headlights vanishing into the dark, empty stretch of highway. For investigators, Michael's brutal attack on Jessica and Adam wasn't just a horrific crime, it was further proof of how far he had unraveled. What had started as a calculated escape was now a spree marked by jealousy, desperation, and pure, unfiltered emotion. Jessica might have pushed him to the edge, but in the end, Michael's always been his own worst enemy, Rachel remarked, staring at the crime scene photos in disbelief. With every decision he makes, he gets sloppier. This is the mistake we're going to use to finally catch him. The deaths of Jessica and Adam added a new layer of urgency to the manhunt for Michael Klein. Now wanted for 4 murders, Michael was no longer just a fugitive. He was a spree killer, dangerous and unpredictable. law enforcement widened the search, posting Michael's name and face across state lines. The trail grew colder with every passing hour, but Harrison remained convinced they were closing in. "If there's one thing I know about Michael," Harrison later reflected, "it's that he doesn't know when to stop. This isn't just about the money anymore. It's Michael against the world, and he's on a path to self-destruction. We just have to make sure we catch him before he takes anyone else down with him." The final clearing and capture of the suspect. By the time Michael Klein stepped off the train at a desolate station near Albuquerque, New Mexico, he wasn't the man he had been in Meadow Ridge, Texas. The once clean-shaven and confident Michael, dressed sharply in his father's view, had transformed into a haggard figure weighed down by paranoia and desperation. His clothes, wrinkled and stained from days of travel, hung loose on his wiry frame. His eyes darted across the empty platform, scanning for any hint of danger. He had no idea this would be the last time he would take a breath as a free man. The trail leading to Michael's capture had been a patchwork of aggressive detective work, chance, and pure persistence. Sheriff Wade Harrison and his team had followed the breadcrumbs he left behind. Jessica's reckless spending, the blown-out scenes of jealousy and violence, and the stolen truck abandoned just days before. Each clue, no matter how small, brought them closer to their quarry. Yet it wasn't until a tip from a sharp-eyed employee at a small coffee shop just outside Flagstaff, Arizona, that they had their first solid lead in days. "He came in looking all jittery," the barista later told investigators. "Kept his hat pulled low like he didn't want anyone seeing his face. Paid in cash, but I don't know. Something about the way he kept looking over his shoulder creeped me out. Then I saw his picture on the news the next morning and just knew it was him." The tip led them to the nearby bus station where Michael had bought a one-way ticket to Albuquerque. From there, it was a waiting game. Law enforcement knew the clock was ticking. The further Michael got from Texas, the harder it would be to track him. They couldn't afford any more delays. An alert was sent to every local and state authority across New Mexico. "We'll get him," Harrison assured Rachel Diaz, who had been working tirelessly around the clock. The exhaustion showed in the bags under her eyes, but the fire in her voice hadn't dimmed. "He can't keep running forever," Rachel replied, her voice steady. "Someone's gonna spot him. He's not as invisible as he thinks he is." Michael's mistake came from the same arrogance that had brought him this far. He thought he could outsmart everyone, slip through the cracks like a ghost. But in the end, his need for freedom collided with his need for comfort, just as it always did. Investigators learned he had diverted from the bus route and hopped onto a train, believing the smaller stations would draw less attention. What Michael didn't count on was how recognizable his face had become across the nation. A train station worker in Albuquerque, scrolling through the news on their phone during a slow shift, recognized Michael immediately as the man who had slinked onto the platform hours earlier. "He looked like he was trying to disappear," they told the FBI later, "but you can't really hide when people know your face." It was just past dusk when the units moved in. The station, a quiet and dusty place nestled on the edge of town, had been locked down by officers in plain clothes well before Michael realized what was happening. He sat hunched on a bench near the far end of the station, his shoulders rounded forward like the weight of the world was pressing him into the ground. He had one hand in his jacket pocket, the other clutching a small backpack filled with the remnants of his broken plan, $2,000 in cash, a burner phone, and a forged ID that reeked of desperation. Harrison watched from a distance, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see Michael's every movement through the grainy feed of a surveillance camera. "This is it," he murmured, his voice low but firm. "We've got him." The arrest was swift and calculated. Within seconds, officers were swarming the platform, weapons drawn. Michael's head snapped up, his expression a mixture of alarm and exhaustion. "Don't move, Michael!" one of them shouted, their voices echoing in the stillness of the station. "Hands where we can see them!" For a fleeting moment it almost seemed like Michael might try to run, like the survival instinct that had carried him this far might kick in one last time. But then his shoulders slumped. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands in the air. Harrison arrived just as Michael was being handcuffed. The dusty evening air carried the faint scent of diesel and dry desert plants. Watching Michael up close, Harrison felt an unsettling mix of emotions, satisfaction that the chase was over, but also a deep, unshakable sadness for the destruction left in this man's wake. "You don't seem so clever now, do you?" Harrison muttered under his breath as he walked alongside Michael to the waiting patrol car. Michael didn't respond. For once the man who had gambled away his entire world in a twisted attempt at a better life had nothing to say. Back at the station, Michael folded quickly under interrogation. He wasn't a hardened killer. He was a desperate man who had reached his breaking point and shattered his own life along with everyone else's. He confessed to everything: the murders of his parents, driven by greed and frustration, the fight with Jessica and subsequent bloodshed, fueled by jealousy and rage, even the death of Adam Hayes, whom he indifferently called collateral damage. He broke easily, Rachel noted later. Once it was clear he wasn't getting away, he just unloaded. It wasn't remorse, it was exhaustion. He was too tired to keep lying. Michael's motives were as petty as they were devastating. He spoke of rage over his parents' refusal to give him what he believed he was entitled to. He described Jessica as manipulative, blaming her for pushing him to the edge. But as Harrison noted during the final debrief, the truth was simpler than that. He killed for greed, Harrison said. For money, for control, because he thought the world owed him something, nothing more, nothing less. The arrest brought the chase to an end, but the scars Michael left behind in Meadow Ridge, Texas, and beyond, would take much longer to heal. Families who had watched him grow up were now left to wrestle with the realization that a man they once trusted had become something unrecognizable. Harrison, sitting in his quiet office days after the capture, stared at the bulletin board littered with photos of the Kleins, crime scenes, and arrest reports. "It's done," he muttered, though the words felt hollow. "But it doesn't feel much like winning." Rachel stopped in the doorway, a thermos of coffee in hand. "We stopped him," she offered quietly. "That counts for something." "Yeah," Harrison said, his voice barely audible. "It does." The court's death sentence. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you, thick and suffocating, like the air before a summer storm. The trial of Michael Klein was nearing its conclusion, and every person in the room seemed to hold their breath as the judge prepared to speak. After months of grief, media frenzy, and an avalanche of evidence detailing Michael's horrific crimes, it had all led to this. Seated at the defense table, Michael looked as though the weight of the entire world had finally crushed him. Gone was the arrogant smirk he wore during his early interviews, the false bravado that had once made him think he could outsmart everyone. His once sharp features now drooped with weariness, his hair unkempt, his suit, likely borrowed, barely fitting, hung awkwardly off his thin frame. Whatever image Michael Klein wanted to project as a proud son of Meadow Ridge had long since dissolved into that of a broken, defeated man. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his steady voice breaking the tense silence. The jury had taken little time to deliberate. The evidence against Michael was overwhelming. The carefully laid-out trail that tied him to the premeditated murders of his parents, Paul and Martha Klein, the violent, emotionally fueled killing of his wife Jessica, and the death of Adam Hayes, the drifter who had tragically been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The prosecution had painted a brutal portrait of Michael, a man consumed by greed, jealousy, and selfish entitlement. His crimes were not spur-of-the-moment acts of desperation, they argued. They were deliberate, calculated, and merciless. Michael Klein slaughtered the very people who loved and trusted him, the prosecutor had said in his searing closing statement. He stole from his parents, he betrayed his wife, and he left a trail of destruction that will haunt his community for generations. This is a man who cared about no one but himself. He is a danger to society, and he should never see the light of day again. The defense team tried to fight back. They focused on Michael's troubled history, pointing to years of financial hardship and the toxic dynamics between Michael and Jessica as explanations for why everything unraveled so violently. "What you see here is not a cold-blooded killer," the defense attorney said, gesturing to Michael, who sat quietly, hands folded in his lap. "You see a deeply flawed man, a man whose life spiraled out of control. We are not arguing innocence, but we're asking you to consider mercy." Mercy. It was a word that hung heavily in the air, but one that felt bitterly ironic given the gruesome, methodical nature of Michael's crimes. In truth, there was little sympathy to be found in the courtroom, not from the jury, not from the families of the victims, and certainly not from the prosecutor who countered sharply, "Michael Klein showed no mercy when he butchered his own parents. He showed no mercy when he killed Jessica out of jealousy. Why then should we extend it to him?" For the residents of Meadow Ridge, the trial felt like both a reckoning and a terrible, unflinching spotlight on their quiet, close-knit town. The people who had once trusted Michael, who had seen him as nothing more than the son of Paul and Martha, a boy who had strayed but could one day find his way back, were now forced to confront a much darker truth about the man he had become. Every day in that courtroom they faced the grisly details of his actions, details they could never unhear. Blood-soaked tarps, forged signatures, mobile records tracking his every move. Carol Reed, the Klein's longtime neighbor, attended every session of the trial, her face pale and strained beneath her wide-brimmed hat. "I thought I'd feel relief when they caught him," she told reporters outside the courthouse. "But sitting there, hearing it all, it's like I'm grieving Paul and Martha all over again, knowing it was their own son. I don't think that kind of heartbreak ever leaves you." For the jury, the decision they faced was not just about guilt, it was about justice. Could someone like Michael Klein ever truly repay the debt of his sins? Was life imprisonment enough for crimes so devastating that they left an entire community shaken to its core? Or did his horrific actions demand the ultimate price? And so, when the jury filed back into the courtroom after only 4 hours of deliberation, everyone knew what was coming. The foreperson stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed out the paper in front of her. Her voice, clear but heavy with weight, echoed across the room. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Michael Klein, guilty of first-degree murder on all counts," she announced. Gasps rippled through the gallery, followed quickly by hushed murmurs. A single stifled sob could be heard from one of the spectators, someone who had known Paul and Martha well, perhaps. The judge leaned forward, his face devoid of emotion. "And does the jury have a recommendation or verdict regarding sentencing?" The foreperson swallowed hard, her voice dropping slightly in volume. "Yes, Your Honor, the jury unanimously recommends the death penalty." The words fell like a hammer. Michael's head remained bowed as though the weight of the sentence physically pressed him down. For a brief moment, his lips tightened, and despite his clear exhaustion, it looked as though he might cry. But then the mask fell back into place, a cold, detached stare that offered nothing. Harrison sat in the gallery, his hands clenched tightly together. He didn't celebrate. He didn't exhale. Justice had been served, yes, but it hadn't erased the devastating loss of life. As he later told Rachel, "It feels like one piece of this story is closed, but the damage he's done will never truly heal." Outside the courthouse, the media gathered like vultures. Reporters thrust microphones toward anyone who would speak, desperate for a quote or reaction. "Justice for Paul and Martha," one sign read. Another simply said, "Death is too kind." For some of the victims' friends and family, the verdict brought closure. "It's the least he deserves," Charlie Mills, one of Paul's oldest friends, said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and grief. "He didn't just destroy his parents, he destroyed everything around him. This town will never be the same because of what he did." But not everyone felt vindicated. Reverend Thompson, the Klein's pastor, quietly shook his head when asked his thoughts. "I don't know if this town will find peace in a death sentence," he said softly. "Hatred won't bring Paul and Martha back, but maybe it'll allow people to move forward in time." For Michael, the death sentence marked the beginning of a slow, inevitable end. He would spend years in his tiny cell on death row, with nothing but time to think about the lives he had stolen and the dreams he had torn apart. Perhaps he would spend those years waiting for appeals that would never save him. Perhaps he would sit in silence, haunted by everything he tried and failed to escape. But for Meadow Ridge, the trial was more than just another courtroom drama. It was a reminder of how greed, entitlement, and blind ambition could rot even the deepest family bonds. It was a warning etched into their collective memory, a scar they would carry for years to come. As Sheriff Harrison walked out of the courtroom into the crisp evening air, he paused for a moment, looking out at the horizon. The case was closed, the suspect caught, the sentencing delivered, and yet, like so many others in his town, all he could feel was a deep, hollow loss. "He got what he deserved," Rachel said, appearing beside him. Harrison nodded slowly. "He did, but it still doesn't feel like enough." Rachel didn't respond. Instead, the two stood together in silence, listening to the faint hum of the crowd dispersing behind them. Somewhere, among the faces lost in that crowd, were the traces of a town that had once known innocence. But innocence, as they both knew, was something you could never truly get back. A profound lesson. From a family tragedy, the tragedy of the Klein family didn't just leave a mark on Meadow Ridge, Texas. It carved its story deep into the hearts of everyone who followed the case. A cautionary tale about greed, betrayal, and the fragility of family bonds. It wasn't just another murder investigation. It wasn't just another headline in the papers or another segment of true crime dissected on late-night television. For Meadow Ridge, the events surrounding Michael Klein were a reflection of how easily love and trust can unravel when poisoned by selfish ambition. "This isn't just about a crime," Sheriff Wade Harrison said during an interview shortly after Michael was sentenced to death. "It's about what happens when someone's priorities go horribly out of balance. At its core, it's about the collapse of a family, and that's something that could happen anywhere." For a long time, Meadow Ridge was known as the kind of town where people waved to their neighbors, baked pies to welcome newcomers, and left their doors unlocked at night. To everyone who lived there, families like the Kleins were symbolic of what made the community so special. Paul and Martha embodied the values so many cherished. They were hard-working, dependable, respectful. They represented kindness, the kind of people who went out of their way to help others without expecting anything in return. "That's what made it so hard to understand," said Carol Reed, their longtime neighbor. "How could someone who came from a family like that, parents who gave so much for their child, turn around and hurt them in a way that you can't ever recover from?" Every step of the investigation revealed layers of Michael's downfall, and each piece of evidence was another source of heartbreak. Neighbors shook their heads as they learned about the tension between Michael and his parents, the arguments over money, and Paul's painful decision to finally say no to his son. It wasn't stubbornness that made Paul stand his ground, it was heartbreak. "Sometimes love doesn't mean saying yes," Paul's close friend Charlie Mills said. "It means teaching someone responsibility, no matter how much it hurts." Those lessons came too late for Michael. As details about Jessica Klein's role emerged, the tragedy deepened. People began to reflect on the dangerous allure of ambition unchecked by compassion. Jessica wanted a life that Meadow Ridge couldn't provide. She wanted wealth, luxury, and success, and she saw Michael as the ticket out. "She used to talk big, you know," said one of Jessica's former co-workers during the trial. "She'd make jokes about how she'd get out of here no matter what, like she was better than the rest of us. But the way she went about it, there's a difference between dreaming big and losing all sense of right and wrong." For some, Jessica's influence on Michael was a cautionary tale about relationships built on selfishness. "It's like they brought out the worst in each other," Charlie said. "Sometimes you see people together and you think, man, they make each other better. But Michael and Jessica, they fueled each other's worst instincts. That's no foundation for anything, let alone a family." At its core, the Klein tragedy raised larger questions that extended far beyond one small Texas town. What motivates someone like Michael Klein to push his family aside, to betray the very people who poured their lives into raising him? How does greed grow from something small, a whispered promise of a better life, a killer opportunity, into something monstrous enough to consume everything in its path? These questions lingered in the minds of everyone involved, from investigators to journalists to the people in the gallery who watched Michael's sentencing. Reverend Thompson, who had ministered to the Kleins for years, offered what he called a painful truth. "The darkness inside Michael wasn't something that just appeared out of nowhere," he said during a town meeting meant to help the community process what had happened. "It grew, little by little over time. Greed, entitlement, jealousy, they start as seeds, and if you don't root them out, they take over. And unfortunately, Michael's were left unchecked until it was too late, until they cost lives." For the people of Meadow Ridge, the lesson wasn't just about Michael's crimes, it was about what they represented. It was about how even the strongest families could break under the wrong pressures. It was about the importance of addressing cracks before they grew into chasms. Parents in town found themselves looking at their children a little differently after the case, wondering if they could do more to build trust, to communicate, to show their kids the value of hard work without pushing them away. "I think a lot of us started asking ourselves questions we didn't want to ask," said Suzanne Taylor, whose grandson had grown up idolizing Michael before everything unraveled. "What could I be missing? How could I make sure I don't lose anyone I love to something like this?" But the case also revealed deep systemic cracks that extended beyond just the family. Jessica's shameless spending and Michael's escalating desperation spoke to the combined power of societal pressures and unchecked personal ambition. Before she died, Jessica's life was a glaring portrait of the culture of never enough, of wanting more, of needing things and status to fill holes that couldn't be filled that way. We live in a world that tells us we're not enough unless we have more, from money to likes on social media to better cars, Rachel Diaz said during a debriefing after the case wrapped up. How many people are out there chasing that at any cost? You think what happened with Jessica and Michael is rare? It's not rare. They just took it to an extreme that ended in tragedy. That's the true warning here. For Sheriff Wade Harrison, the case wasn't just a professional milestone, it was a personal journey. He carried the weight of Paul and Martha's loss on his shoulders, knowing that they were more than just victims. They were people who had trusted the world to protect them. That trust had been violated by their own son, in the harshest and most unforgivable way. "When I think about Paul and Martha," Harrison said, gazing out at the Meadow Ridge farmland dotted with windmills, "I think about all the little ways they contributed to this town. The pies Martha would bake for church, the times Paul showed up with a toolbox when someone's tractor broke down, and now they're gone. Why? Because of greed. Because of misplaced dreams. Because their own son thought the world owed him something it didn't." The lessons left behind by the Klein family went beyond grief and caution. They were a reminder of what happens when we forget to nurture the things that truly matter: love, family, community, accountability. For Meadow Ridge, moving forward meant more than just healing. It meant reflecting on how to protect those values, even when the world seemed determined to pull them apart. In the words of Charlie Mills, reflecting on the loss of his old friend Paul, "We won't ever forget this. But if forgetting's not an option, maybe the least we can do is learn." By the end of the day, when the reporters left and the courtroom emptied, the Klein family tragedy didn't just leave Meadow Ridge behind, it left the world with a question. How far do we let ambition and entitlement go before we stop ourselves? For the town, for the community, and beyond, the case wasn't just a story of crime. It was a story of what it means to lose sight of what matters, and of how hard it is to find your way back once you've crossed that line.